Hi guys, let's look at the poem The Garden of Love by William Blake. Let's start by looking at the context of the poem. William Blake was born in London in 1757. He was a spiritual man, but he was very critical of the Church of England and of organized religion. This is when the focus of religion is placed on obeying the rules and laws, or else one will be punished by God. The poet makes a clear difference between being spiritual, meaning a genuine relationship with God, which brings joy, freedom, and happiness, and religion, which causes guilt, shame, and oppression because it is impossible to obey all the rules and laws made by the church. The poet comments on how religion, a set of rules, turns the world from a garden filled with joy and life into a graveyard filled with death and decay. This poem is not against being religious. It is against the way that religion has become organized, where there is a big focus on obeying rules and laws, which is the opposite of its original message, which is love, joy, freedom, and happiness. The poem argues that organized religion kills the joy of living. Let's analyze the structure of the poem. This poem has 12 lines, and there are three stanzas over there, which consist of three quatrains, which means a group of 4 lines. So each stanza is made up of 4 lines. Let's look at the rhyme scheme. A, B, C, B, D, E, F, E, G, H, I, J. So here we see that stanza 1 and stanza 2 follow the same rhyming pattern, A, B, C, B. So the second and the fourth line rhyme. On the other hand, stanza 3 only has internal rhyme, and we see that in lines 11 and 12. Gowns, rounds, briars, desires. It's also important to note that stanza 3 has longer lines than the rest of the stanzas, and this is to emphasize the death and decay of the garden of love. This will make more sense when we look at the poem in more detail. The meter of the poem is mostly anapestic, and this is because it has 2 unstressed syllables, which are followed by 1 stressed syllable in each line in the poem. The tone of the poem is indignant, angry, disappointed, and dismayed. Let's do an in-depth analysis of each line. I went to the garden of love, and saw what I never had seen. A chapel was built in the midst, where I used to play on the green. In line 1, the poet tells us that he went to the garden of love. This could be referring to a peaceful and joyful place that the speaker visited before, but it could also be symbolic for a state of innocent joyfulness. It is interesting to note that the term garden of love is capitalized, so it becomes a proper noun, and this shows us that there is deeper meaning. It shows symbolism and the significance of the place. The Garden of Love is also an allusion to the Garden of Eden in the Bible, where the first humans, Adam and Eve, lived freely, spontaneously, and naively. And saw what I never had seen. The word never in line 2 shows the speaker's shock and disbelief. It's also interesting to note that line 2 ends with a colon, and this shows us that an explanation is about to follow. A chapel was built in the midst. Chapel here represents the church and organized religion as a whole. The capital letter C implies that the chapel is occupying physical space and invading the area where the speaker used to play, so it's invading his state of innocent joyfulness. The word midst means middle. Here the speaker shows how the chapel is intruding and trespassing on his pleasant carefree memories. It is almost as if the chapel's intrusion is unpleasant and it is ruining the joyful free state that the speaker once had. It is ruining the open space in the garden, where I used to play on the green. The word play is associated with freedom and joy, which is what the garden should be filled with. And green refers to the grass and open space where the garden once was, but it can also refer to innocence, inexperience, and being naive, which is what the first humans were in the Garden of Eden. Stanza 1 can be summarized as a comparison of how the Garden of Love used to be and how it is now in the poet's time. And the gates of this chapel were shut, and thou shalt not writ over the door. So I turned to the garden of love that so many sweet flowers bore. In line 5, the word gates symbolizes the restriction and loss of freedom. The word shut shows us that the chapel was supposed to be a place that was welcoming and that encouraged people to come and commune with one another and with God, but instead is the opposite. And thou shalt not. These words are an allusion to the Ten Commandments, which forbid certain behaviors. It also reinforces the sense of restriction that the chapel is placing on the people. We then see a full stop or period in the middle of the line. This creates a sense of authority and finality. It emphasizes the restrictiveness and oppressive nature of organized religion. Writ simply means written. Writ over the door. This shows that the focus of the church at that time was on rules and laws which caused condemnation. So the rules and laws that the church put in place caused people to feel guilty and full of shame, and this was ruining their joy and happiness. We also see examples of consonants in lines 5 and 6. This is the repetition of the t sound, and this creates a harsh tone, and this emphasizes the idea of being closed off or locked out. So I turned to the garden of love that so many sweet flowers bore. The word flowers in line 8 is symbolic for life. Lines 7 and 8 are symbolic for wanting to go back to the way humanity was before organized religion stole the joy out of life, like in the Garden of Eden. The poet wants to go back to that state of innocent joyfulness before organized religion came and ruined that joy. Here the poet is reminiscing about how it used to be in the garden when it was full of life. We also see long vowel sounds which mimic the open and joyous place that the garden of love once was. It was free, open, and joyful. Stanza 2 can be summarized as the poet's description of organized religion. And I saw it was filled with graves, and tombstones where flowers should be, and priests in black gowns were walking their rounds, and binding with briars my joys and desires. In line 9, the word graves is a symbol of death. We also see another symbol of death in line 10, tombstones. In lines 9 and 10, the poet describes how things have changed. And I saw it filled with graves and tombstones where flowers should be. Here the poet describes how things have changed. Since the chapel was built, representing organized religion, the flowers, life, have been replaced by tombstones and graves, which are symbols for death. So organized religion has brought about death and loss of life. In other words, the poet says that when you are forced to follow the laws and restrictions of religion, you are restricted from living, and that joy and happiness that you once had is actually killed. And priests in black gowns were walking their rounds. Here we see a shift in the poem. The speaker is no longer alone in the garden. He is now joined by priests in black gowns. The image of priests in black gowns is an ominous image. It shows us that they are threatening figures because they are the ones enforcing the restrictions. The black gowns also hint at death and funerals. So, in a sense, the speaker is telling us that the priests are responsible for killing the innocence, joy, and happiness of living because they are the ones enforcing the rules and the laws and the restrictions that the church have imposed. Were walking their rounds. This highlights the roles that the priests play in the death of the garden. So, in other words, the death of the speaker's joys and desires. And binding with briars my joys and desires. Briars are thorny branches, And here the poet is actually providing an image of how the priests enforce the restrictions and tell people how to live a religious life. And they do this by instilling guilt, fear, and shame, thereby robbing people of the joy of living life. It is also interesting to note that the poet gives us an example of alliteration. This example, binding briars, creates a sense of finality or end. His joys and desires come to an end. It is also important to note the repetition of the word and. This is an example of polysyndeton. The repetition of and intensifies the sound of the poem and makes it feel more authoritative. And was frequently repeated in the early 1600s King James Version of the Bible. Stanza 3 can be summarized as a description of negativity and death having ruined the joyful life that once was in the garden. It shows how the happiness and joy of life has been destroyed by organized religion. Let's look at the metaphorical meaning of the poem. The Garden of Love is symbolic for the biblical Garden of Eden, an earthly paradise where the first humans lived joyfully and in innocence. This was before sin ruined their innocence and joy. This was referred to as the fall of man. This poem describes how things were before and after the fall of man, but the fall is caused by organized religion instead of sin like the initial narrative. The poet believes that organized religion is the modern cause for the fall of man, because it kills mankind's joy and happiness in life. It goes against the original purpose of religion, which is supposed to be love, joy, and freedom. Let's take a look at some of the symbols we see in the poem and what each of them represents. The Garden of Love represents the Garden of Eden, or a state of living in joy, freedom, and innocence. The chapel represents the church and its enforced organized religion. Graves, tombstones, and black represent death and destruction. Gates represent restriction and oppression. Flowers and green represent life, freedom, and joy. Thou shalt not represents the Ten Commandments, restriction, oppression, rules, and laws. Priests in black gowns represent enforcers of the law and restrictions. Thanks for watching, guys. I hope this has helped. Please remember to like and subscribe.